I don't shake hands with a staff.
For seconds, that's all it took for CEO Richard Grant to destroy a billion-dollar empire. He refused a simple handshake from his staff, unaware the man he humiliated was the only person who could save his company. As the elevator doors close, a viral video is already ending his career. Grant enters the boardroom a king, but he's about to leave a ghost. The story is just getting interesting. Subscribe now. Your voice matters in the fight against corporate prejudice. Richard Grant stared out his floor-to-ceiling window, but he wasn't looking at the skyline. He was looking at the numbers reflected in the glass. $5 billion. That was the figure Jennifer had circled on the briefing memo. It wasn't just a capital infusion. It was the price of immortality for Apexion Technologies. If the Sterling Investment Group signed the Renewable Energy Partnership tomorrow, Grant would no longer just be a CEO. He would be the man who owned the future of the grid. He checked his watch. It was barely noon, and the silence of the executive floor felt like a heavy shroud. He hated clutter, and he hated noise. He had already given the order to clear the floor of any unnecessary personnel. Distractions, he had called them. In Grant's mind, a company was a machine, and the people at the bottom were just interchangeable parts, grease for the gears that turned his vision into reality. He believed the boardroom was a sanctuary for those who moved markets, not for the people who moved boxes or coded the scripts. Jennifer, Grant said, not bothering to turn around as his assistant entered. Is the presentation deck finalized? It's ready, Mr. Grant, she replied, her voice tight. The projections for the solar thermal transition are locked in. But William Sterling is known for being unconventional. He doesn't always stick to the script. Grant let out a dry, sharp laugh. Everyone has a script when $5 billion is on the table. Sterling wants efficiency and dominance. That's what I'm giving him. I've built a tower that touches the clouds. He's not going to care about the basement. He paced the length of the room, mentally rehearsing his opening lines. He saw himself as a visionary, a man who saw the world in blueprints and bottom lines. To him, the staff were invisible, a background hum that only mattered when it became a nuisance. He had spent a decade building Apexion into a monolith, and he wasn't about to let human warmth or office sentimentality get in the way of the closing bell. He was ready to change the world, and in his mind, the world didn't include the people standing on the ground floor. The lobby of Apexion Technologies was buzzing with the usual midday rush when the elevator doors slid open. Richard Grant stepped out, flanked by two junior executives who struggled to match his aggressive stride. He was checking his watch, his mind already 3 floors up in the boardroom, when a man in a denim jacket stepped into his path. Rohan Malhotra had just finished a double shift in the server room, his backpack heavy with hardware tools and his eyes tired but bright. Seeing his CEO, Rohan did what he had done for 5 years. He extended his hand with a genuine smile. Morning, Richard. The new cooling arrays are finally stable. We're ready for the expansion, Rohan said, his voice steady and professional. Grant didn't just stop, he recoiled. He looked at Rohan's outstretched hand as if it were covered in grease, then slowly shifted his gaze to the backpack and the worn jeans. The silence in the lobby became vacuum-sealed. I don't shake hands with staff, Grant said, his voice loud enough to echo off the high ceilings. He didn't lower his voice or try to make it a private correction. He wanted the humiliation to be felt. Stick to the basement, Rohan. And in the future, don't address me by my first name. You're paid to maintain the systems, not to be my peer. Rohan's hand remained suspended in the air for a second too long. He felt the heat crawl up his neck, not from shame, but from the sheer, naked arrogance of a man he had helped make a billionaire. I was only being polite, sir, Rohan replied, his voice dropping an octave. He didn't pull his hand back immediately. He let it hang there as a testament to the gap between them. Grant didn't care. He brushed past Rohan, nearly clipping his shoulder, and barked at his assistants to keep moving. What Grant failed to notice was Sarah, a marketing intern standing by the security desk. She had been filming a day in the life at Apexion for the company's social media feed, and her phone was pointed directly at the exchange. She hadn't just captured a greeting. She had captured a character assassination in 4K. As Grant disappeared into a private elevator, Sarah looked at her screen, her thumb hovering over the upload button. She wasn't the only one who saw it. Two security guards stood with their jaws tight, watching Rohan slowly lower his hand and adjust his backpack. Rohan took a deep breath, his dignity intact, but his view of the company forever altered. "Understood, Mr. Grant," he muttered to the empty air. He turned toward the exit, unaware that Sarah had already hit post. Within 90 seconds, the video had 10,000 views. By the time Grant reached the executive suite, the hashtag HandshakeGate was already starting to climb the charts. The world was about to see the unmasked face of Apexion, and it only took 4 seconds of footage to put a $5 billion price tag on Richard Grant's pride. Rohan Malhotra didn't need the paycheck from Apexion Technologies, but he needed the work. Most of his colleagues saw the grease under his fingernails and the worn straps of his backpack and assumed he was just another technician grinding out a living in the server rooms. They didn't know that his home office was lined with 2 master's degrees, one in systems engineering and another in renewable energy infrastructure. He had spent 6 years in postgraduate study, not to climb a corporate ladder, but because he genuinely gave a damn about how the world powered itself. He was the silent architect behind the very systems Richard Grant touted in his glossy brochures, the man who stayed late to fix the logic errors that high-priced consultants couldn't find. His brother-in-law, William Sterling, had spent the last 3 years trying to convince Rohan to leave the trenches. "You're overqualified to be fixing hardware for a man like Grant," Sterling would tell him during their Sunday dinners. "I'll give you a seat on my board tomorrow. You can have a corner office and a salary that matches your IQ." Rohan always gave the same answer. He didn't want a leg up or a favor based on who he sat next to at Thanksgiving. He believed that a man's value wasn't determined by his connections, but by the weight of his own output and how he carried himself when no one was looking. To Rohan, the dignity of the work was the point. He wanted to be judged by the code he wrote and the grids he stabilized, not the name on his wedding invitation. This commitment to earning his way made the snub in the lobby sting with a specific kind of irony. Grant had looked at Rohan and seen an invisible man, a member of the staff, who was beneath the basic courtesy of a handshake. Grant saw a lack of status and assumed a lack of substance. He had no idea that the staff member he just humiliated was the primary reason the Apexion solar thermal project was actually viable. Rohan had spent his weekends troubleshooting the thermal lag issues that had nearly tanked the project's pilot phase. He had saved the company millions in potential losses, all while being addressed as the guy from maintenance. Rohan walked out of the building and sat on a concrete bench a block away, watching the digital ticker on the side of the Apexion tower. He thought about the $5 billion deal looming over the afternoon. He knew William Sterling was likely already in the building, and he knew Sterling didn't value optics nearly as much as he valued character. For years, Rohan had protected Grant's reputation by doing the hard work in the shadows, never asking for the spotlight. But as he checked his phone and saw the marketing intern's video beginning to spread through his department's group chat, he realized that his silence was no longer a virtue. The man who refused to touch his hand was about to learn that the people he considered invisible were the only ones holding his world together. Richard Grant straightened his tie in the reflection of his darkened computer screen, oblivious to the fact that the same screen was about to become his executioner. Upstairs in the executive wing, the air was pressurized with the anticipation of the Sterling deal, but downstairs, the digital world was already tearing the building's foundation apart. The video Sarah had posted wasn't just a clip, it was an indictment. It had bypassed the usual slow burn of corporate PR and gone straight to the jugular of the public consciousness. Within 20 minutes, the view count crossed the 500,000 mark. By the time Grant sat down to review his opening remarks, it had cleared 3 million. The hashtag HandshakeGate was moving with the speed of a brush fire. It wasn't just activists or angry strangers watching. It was the very people who kept Apexion Technologies running. On the internal Slack channels, the engineers' chat, usually a stream of code snippets and server logs, fell silent for exactly 60 seconds after the video was shared. Then, it exploded. Developers who had worked 80-hour weeks for Grant's vision began posting screenshots of their own, ignored emails, and dismissed suggestions. The invisible workforce was suddenly finding its voice, and that voice was a roar of collective resentment. Grant's phone began to buzz incessantly on his desk, but he ignored it, assuming it was just more congratulatory messages from minor partners. He didn't see the notifications from the company's social media manager, who was currently having a panic attack in a cubicle 3 floors down. He didn't see the 2% dip in the pre-market trading price that signaled the first tremors of institutional doubt. To Grant, the world was still a place where a CEO could dictate reality through sheer force of will. He was so insulated by his own arrogance that he couldn't hear the sound of his own brand decomposing in real time. Outside the conference room, William Sterling stood quietly, his own phone open to the live stream. He watched the loop of Grant recoiling from Rohan, his friend, his brother-in-law, the man who had taught him more about integrity than any MBA program ever could. Sterling didn't look angry. He looked disappointed, which was far more dangerous. He watched the comment section scroll by, thousands of people calling for a boycott, hundreds of employees threatening to walk. He looked at the heavy doors of the boardroom, and then back at the screen where Rohan was lowering his hand with a quiet, devastating grace. The fallout was no longer a possibility. It was an avalanche, and Richard Grant was standing right in its path with his hand out, expecting a check. Richard Grant smoothed the front of his jacket and checked his reflection in the polished surface of the heavy boardroom door. He took a breath, adjusted his posture, and pushed the door open with a flourish of practiced confidence. He walked into room A with the broad, easy smile of a man who already considered the $5 billion his. "Mr. Sterling," Grant projected, his voice rich with the charisma he had used to climb to the top of Apexion Technologies. "A pleasure to finally have you here. Today is the day we officially move the world toward a cleaner future." He marched toward the head of the table, his hand already extended for the greeting that was supposed to seal the partnership. But William Sterling didn't move. He sat perfectly still, his hands clasped on top of a tablet that was glowing with a harsh blue light. Beside him, Nova Coleman sat with her arms crossed, her face a mask of cold professionalism. The air in the room didn't feel like a celebration. It felt like a deposition. Grant's hand hung in the air for a second before he realized Sterling wasn't going to take it. He lowered it slowly, his smile faltering but not yet breaking. "I assume you've had a chance to look over the final solar thermal projections?" Grant asked, trying to pivot back to the script. He moved to the front of the room to start the presentation, but the silence from the table was absolute. Sterling wasn't looking at the projection screen. He was looking directly at Grant with an intensity that made the CEO's collar feel suddenly tight. There were no pleasantries, no small talk about the flight in, and no comments on the impressive view of the city. "The projections are fine, Richard," Sterling finally said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that cut through Grant's rehearsed energy. "But I'm not here to talk about the thermal lag in your cooling arrays. I'm here to talk about the foundation of this company." Grant chuckled nervously, adjusting his cufflinks. "The foundation is rock solid. Our growth metrics are leading the sector, and our internal efficiencies." "I'm not talking about metrics," Sterling interrupted, leaning forward. He tapped the screen of his tablet and slid it toward the center of the table. The video from the lobby began to play, the clear, 4K footage of Grant recoiling from Rohan Malhotra. The sound of Grant's own voice saying "I don't shake hands with staff" echoed through the silent boardroom. Grant's face went pale, then a deep, mottled red. He opened his mouth to explain, to dismiss it as a momentary lapse or a misunderstanding, but the look in Sterling's eyes stopped him cold. The trap had been set the moment Grant stepped out of that elevator, and now, in the room where he felt most powerful, he realized he was the one being hunted. Richard Grant stared at the tablet screen, the video looping the exact moment his hand recoiled from the man in the denim jacket. The silence in the boardroom was heavy, pressurized by William Sterling's unblinking stare. Grant cleared his throat, a sharp, dry sound that did nothing to ease the tension. Williams, look, I understand how that looks on camera. It was a stressful morning, and I was focused on our meeting. I have thousands of employees. Sometimes you have to maintain boundaries to keep the machine moving. It's an internal HR matter, nothing more. Sterling didn't blink. He didn't lean back. He just tapped his finger on the table, a rhythmic, hollow sound. The machine, Sterling repeated, his voice flat. You talk about your company like it's made of steel and silicon, Richard. But I invest in people. So tell me, the man in the hallway, the man you just told the entire world wasn't worth a handshake. What is his name? Grant felt a bead of sweat form at his hairline. He glanced toward Nova Coleman, looking for an out, but she was looking at her notepad, refusing to meet his eyes. Grant turned back to Sterling, forcing a dismissive shrug. He's one of the junior systems guys, I believe. Or maybe hardware maintenance. We have a high headcount in the technical tiers. I can have my assistant get you his file if it's that important to you. I'm not asking for a file, Sterling said, his voice dropping into a dangerous register. I'm asking you, the CEO of Apexion Technologies, to tell me the name of the man who has worked in your server rooms for 5 years. The man who holds 2 master's degrees and single-handedly resolved the thermal lag issues that made this entire $5 billion deal possible. What is his name? Grant opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He realized with a sickening jolt that he truly didn't know. He had seen the man's face 100 times in the hallways, had passed him in the cafeteria, and had even stood next to him in the elevator, but he had never bothered to read the badge clipped to his belt. To Grant, he was just a moving part in a denim jacket. I don't see why his specific name is relevant to the capital structure of this merger, Grant stammered. It's relevant because his name is Rohan Malhotra, Sterling said, leaning forward until he was inches from Grant's face. He is the lead architect of your core infrastructure. He is also my brother-in-law. I've sat at his dinner table for years listening to him talk about his pride in this company. Pride that you just spat on because you thought he was just staff. You didn't just insult a technician, Richard. You exposed the fact that you don't even know who is building your own tower. Grant's face went from pale to a ghostly white. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in as the weight of his own ignorance settled in his chest. He had spent years obsessing over the vision of Apexion, but he had forgotten that a vision is nothing without the people who turn the screws. Sterling pulled the tablet back toward him, his expression one of pure, cold clarity. If you don't know the names of the people who make you successful, you don't deserve to lead them. Williams Sterling stood up, his height casting a shadow across the boardroom table that seemed to swallow Richard Grant's composure. He didn't look at the charts or the glossy projections. He looked at Grant as if he were examining a structural flaw in a condemned building. I came here today to invest in the future of energy, Sterling said, his voice echoing in the sudden, sharp silence. But looking at you, Richard, I realize that your company has a liability that doesn't show up on a balance sheet. You have a character deficit that makes this entire firm a toxic asset. Grant tried to stand, his hands trembling as they pressed against the tabletop. Williams, let's be rational. A $5 billion merger shouldn't hinge on a 30-second interaction in a lobby. We're talking about global infrastructure. We're talking about the market. The market is already talking back, Sterling countered. He turned his tablet around again, but this time it wasn't the video. It was a live trading floor ticker. The Apexion Technologies stock symbol was flashing a violent, jagged red. You've been in this room for 15 minutes. In that time, your market cap has evaporated by 20%. Your shareholders aren't just selling, they're fleeing. People don't want to own a piece of a man who thinks basic human respect is a distraction. Grant's mouth went dry. He looked at the plummeting line on the graph, realizing that the digital world had moved faster than his ability to lie. The viral video hadn't just sparked outrage. It had signaled to every investor that Apexion was led by a man with no pulse on his own culture. I won't put a single cent of sterling capital into a company where the CEO views his most brilliant minds as invisible, Sterling continued, his tone final and cold. You called Rohan's staff like it was a slur. In my world, we call him the foundation. Without him, You're just a man in an expensive suit standing in an empty tower. Sterling grabbed his tablet and headed for the door. The deal is dead, Richard. And by the time the West Coast markets open, I suspect your career will be too. I don't partner with toxic waste. The heavy door clicked shut, leaving Grant alone in the silence. He looked down at his phone, which was finally lighting up with hundreds of missed calls from the board of directors. The $5 billion was gone, and as he watched the ticker drop another 2 points, he realized that his dignity had been the first thing he lost. He just hadn't noticed until the price tag was attached. The digital silence on the engineering Slack channel didn't last long. It was replaced by a coordinated, rhythmic surge of activity. It started on the 10th floor. A lead developer stood up, closed his laptop with a definitive snap, and walked toward the exit without saying a word. Then another stood. Then an entire row. Within minutes, the quiet hum of the Apexion Technologies workspace was replaced by the sound of hundreds of chairs rolling back and the heavy tread of boots on the floor. The movement wasn't limited to the technical staff. In the accounting department, the spreadsheets were left mid-calculation. In the mailroom, packages were left on the sorting tables. Even the custodial crew, the men and women who Grant had treated as part of the architecture for years, leaned their mops against the walls and pulled off their reflective vests. They weren't just walking out because of a viral video. They were walking out because the video had given a name and a face to the invisible wall Grant had built between himself and the people who made him rich. By the time the elevator doors opened on the ground floor, a human tide was pouring into the lobby. Security guards, who usually spent their days enforcing Grant's no distraction policies, didn't move to stop them. Instead, they unclipped their radios, set them on the marble counters, and joined the back of the line. The lobby, which Grant had wanted cleared of staff just hours earlier, was now overflowing with them. They didn't shout, and they didn't carry signs. The silence of 300 people leaving their posts simultaneously was louder than any protest. Rohan Malhotra was standing across the street, watching the glass doors swing open repeatedly. He saw the senior architects he had worked with for years, the interns who had filmed the snub, and the receptionists who had witnessed his humiliation. They gathered around him on the sidewalk, a quiet assembly of the people who actually knew how the building breathed. One by one, they reached out. Some shook his hand, others just nodded or patted his shoulder. Grant watched from his high-altitude window, his face pressed against the glass. From 30 stories up, they looked like ants, but for the first time in his life, he realized he couldn't control their colony. The phones were ringing off the hook, but there was no one left in the building to answer them. The servers were beginning to overheat because the cooling maintenance cycle had been skipped. The machine was grinding to a halt because the parts had decided they were tired of being grease. As the crowd outside grew, the stock ticker on his screen took another sharp, final dive. Grant was still the CEO of Apexion, but he was presiding over a ghost ship. The people had taken the company's value with them when they walked out the door. The board of directors didn't even wait for the sun to set before they stripped Richard Grant's name from the building's directory. By the time the security team escorted him out through the side exit, the same one used for trash removal, the news of the $5 billion collapse had already gone global. Grant left with nothing but his personal laptop and a shattered reputation, leaving behind a company that was literally vibrating with the sound of its own rebirth. 6 months later, the top-floor office at Apexion Technologies felt different. The air was no longer thick with the forced silence of intimidation. Instead, it carried the low, steady hum of a team that actually wanted to be there. Rohan Malhotra sat behind the desk, though he spent most of his time at the small workbench he'd installed near the window. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was still the same man in the denim jacket, but now his title was VP of Strategy and Culture. He hadn't taken the job because of his connection to William Sterling. He had taken it because the employees, the staff Grant had tried to ignore, had refused to return to work unless Rohan was the one leading the transition. The company had been restructured from the ground up. The executive floor was no longer a restricted zone. The engineers, the janitors, and the analysts moved through the halls with a sense of ownership that money couldn't buy. The $5 billion deal with Sterling had eventually gone through, but only after the board signed a charter that guaranteed total transparency and a fair wage gap. Sterling had been right. The technical projections were solid, but they only worked when the human foundation was respected. A knock came at the door. It was William Sterling, looking far more relaxed than he had on the day of the boardroom showdown. He leaned against the doorframe, watching Rohan look out over the city. "Stocks back up to pre-crash levels," Sterling said. "Actually, it's 2 points higher. Turns out investors like companies that don't have to worry about mass walkouts every Tuesday." Rohan smiled, turning away from the window. "I told a reporter yesterday that I extended my hand in friendship and one man refused it. But millions of people reached back. That's the real currency." Somewhere across town, in a small, quiet apartment, Richard Grant watched the evening news. He saw the segment on the Apexion turnaround and watched as Rohan Malhotra explained the new renewable grid to a national audience. Grant finally understood that respect wasn't a luxury or a distraction. It was the only thing that kept the tower from falling down. He had built a monument to his own ego, but he had forgotten that a building is only as strong as the people who stand on the ground floor. Respect is free, but as Richard Grant learned the hard way, the lack of it is the most expensive mistake a leader can ever make. Richard Grant believed that respect was a luxury he couldn't afford to give to his staff. He was wrong. Respect is free, but as it turns out, the lack of it cost him $5 billion, his legacy, and his dignity. He built a tower to touch the clouds, but he forgot that a building is only as strong as the people who stand on the ground floor. At Apexion Technologies, the name on the door changed, but the lesson remained. Every person in the building, from the server room to the boardroom, carries the weight of the company's future. If you believe that dignity is non-negotiable and that true leadership starts with a handshake, hit the like button and subscribe. Share this story to remind the world that character is the only currency that never devalues. Every story matters, and every act of respect can change the world. Thanks for watching.